Hello, and welcome to 8-Bit Monsters Monster Deconstruction for D&D 5th Edition. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at a higher than usual CR monster, the Remorhaz, a frigid yet inferno-based monster found in the wintry norths of pretty much any campaign setting. In fact, I might end up using one as well. Yeah, sure. It could be fun to see my players flail about after being swallowed and such. Anyways, the Remorhaz is a CR 11 worth 7,200 XP, and if we were to look at Xanathar's guide for encounter building, as a group monster, we would need 6 players at 11th level, 5 players at 12th level, 4 players at 13th and 14th level, or 3 players at 15th level in order to actually fight this monster with other monsters as well. If you wanted to place the Remorhaz as an epic encounter for your players, you could pit this against 6 players at 7th level, 5 players at 8th level, or also 4 players at 9th level. Now, if you ever wanted to actually use this as a solar encounter, you couldn't actually do that. The Remorhaz is actually too high for standard adventurers to solo, although if your adventurers were really well equipped, they could probably take this on. But from Xanathar's guide for encounter building, you could duo this monster at anywhere from a level 17 and up. Who knows? It could be possible, Troll. If the players have the right gear, it's really hard to gauge at this point. So, where was I? Right! So yeah, this is a pretty nasty monster, especially when we take a look at all of its abilities, attacks, and whatnot. Now let's get into that TLDW and see what's going on with this monster. Now for its DCR, I found a 10. Its OCR, I found a 12. And for its final combat rating, I found an 11. Which is great news because, hey, what do you know, it's a printed CR 11 monster. But let's take a look at the finer details and see why this monster is actually closer in range to the printed CR 11, but could still be a terror on the battlefield. Moving into the skills and traits section, due to its CR level, our Remorhaz is going to have a proficiency bonus of +4. The ironic part here is that the Remorhaz doesn't have any skills or traits that are going to be taking advantage of this +4 bonus. But we'll see that later on in the attack section. Moving on into the skills section, we'll take a look and see that the Remorhaz actually has damage immunities to cold and fire. The cold is because it lives in the frigid norths, and the fire is to help it survive in those frigid norths by basically having an inferno running inside of them at all times. On top of this Remorhaz living in the frigid norths, one thing I'd like to take note here is the tremor sense that it has for 60 feet. The Remorhaz likes to burrow underneath the snows and ice and wait for monsters and other prey to travel overhead. So this is something important to keep in mind if you ever use this against your players. The Remorhaz will burst out of its hiding spot and attack unsuspecting travelers in the snowy norths of your world, or even in snowy souths. Now that the skill section is finished, let's take a look at its traits and see what's going on here. The Remorhaz has Heated Body, and all this really does is adds +10 damage per round to the monster's abilities, because any creature within 5 feet that is attacking or just standing there will take, on average, +10 damage per round. Well, if you'd have a fire in your belly, maybe you'd start dealing free extra damage as well. On top of having the heated body, there's something extra that we're going to take into consideration here, and that's its bite and grapple from the OCR section. Because the Remorhaz can grapple something, this is going to give a +1 AC bonus to the creature when we get to the DCR section, so we'll have to make sure to keep that in mind on top of its +10 DPR that it's going to get for the OCR section. Now that we've finished the skills and traits, let's move into the DCR. Luckily, our Remorhaz doesn't have anything affecting its hit points, so we're going to go right into the effective hit points at 195. That comes from 17 D12 plus 85 hit points, and this is because the Remorhaz is a huge monster, hence the D12. The effective hit points are going to put our Remorhaz at a DCR of 9. This is going to get adjusted a little bit once we get into the AC. The actual AC of a Remorhaz is a 17, which comes from its natural armor. Because of the grapple ability, this is going to add a +1 AC bonus to it, and its effective AC is going to be an 18. You see, Troll, the problem is that you let go, our monster doesn't. Stop letting go. Okay, back to the DCR. When we take a look at our chart, we'll see that a DCR of 9 is expected to have an AC of 16. So, because of this, it's +2 over the expected, and that results in a +1 shift from a DCR of 9 to DCR 10. Now that we have the DCR figured out, let's take a look at the OCR. In the OCR section, the first thing we're going to take a look at is the bite plus fire damage. The bite deals 40 damage coming from 60, 10, plus 7. On top of that, the fire damage from the bite is going to add an additional 10.5 damage coming from 3d6. This results in a total of 50.5 damage on average, and this results in an OCR of 7. Next is the swallow ability. If the Remorhaz still has a creature bitten by the next round of combat, it can attempt to swallow. And because of this, the Remorhaz is allowed to bite once more, and on that successful bite, they can swallow the creature. Once the creature is swallowed, on the beginning of the creature's turn, they'll take an additional 21 damage coming from 6d6, which results in an OCR of 3. Now, because of rules of swallowing, the damage is only suggested for the next 2 rounds of combat. So if a Remorhaz has someone swallowed, they can expect at least 2 rounds of combat damage, resulting in 21 points of acid damage each round. The other thing to note here with swallow for the Remorhaz is that there's no limit on the amount of creatures it can swallow, and can swallow a creature every 2 turns of combat, as long as the attacks are successful. You're getting a little ahead of yourself, Troll. You'll see why in a little bit. Now, recatching my train of thought, but once we take a look at the attack bonus, we'll see that that's more than likely going to happen. Next is the heated body damage that it gets from having any melee combatants just within range of it. And again, that's 10 extra damage per round, coming from 3d6, and this results in an OCR of 1, but nothing too terribly crazy to consider. Now that we have all the attacks out of the way for the Remorhaz, we'll take a look at the average damage coming from all of its abilities, and that's a total of 74 points of damage, which results in an OCR of 11. Now let's take a look at the attack bonus, and because the Remorhaz has nothing affecting it, we're going to look at its effective attack bonus at +11. When we compare the attack bonus to the chart, we'll see that an OCR 11 is expected to have an attack bonus of +8. This is actually +3 over the expected rating, and results in a +1 shift from OCR 11 to OCR 12. So we have the Remorhaz's OCR figured out. Let's take a look at the final combat rating and see what it looks like in action. So, for the FCR, we're going to take a look at the bite and the swallow. And this will result in a DCR of 10, plus an OCR of 12, which results in a 22, and we average that out to 11. Perfect. We have the printed value of the Remorhaz at SCR 11. With that, let's take a look at some notes and see what are some other things that could allow this Remorhaz to increase or decrease its FCR a little bit. First note, the heated body. This is going to assume that there's really only one melee combatant fighting the Remorhaz at any given time. Sometimes the party may consist of more melee combatants, sometimes it might have less. So if the Remorhaz is actually squaring off with maybe 3 melee party members and 2 ranged members, the Remorhaz is going to start getting some extra damage in there and increasing its OCR a little bit. The next note is its swallow ability. As I mentioned before, there's no limit at all in the amount of players that can fit in the monster's belly, or any other NPCs that unfortunately get in the way of the Remorhaz's bite. Although, the more that are swallowed, the more likely that the Remorhaz will regurgitate the targets in its belly over time, because it can only take so much internal damage before it regurgitates the targets inside. So that's something to keep into consideration if you're a DM using a Remorhaz. You might want to max out at maybe tops 2 players inside of the Remorhaz at any given time. If a player happens to go unconscious from the acid damage inside of the Remorhaz, sure, target another player and see if swallowing it will help keep the party in dire straits. So, is the CR balanced? Yeah, it is. Meanwhile, the DCR and the OCR are actually the closest they've ever been to the printed value in most of these cases. Sometimes we have extremely low DCRs with extremely high OCRs, and in one case with the werewolf we actually had the flip where the OCR was the low range and the DCR was the high range. So let's take a look at the CR review. Now, our DCR is 1 step under the printed CR value. Its hit points are kinda low for a CR 11, but the higher AC does make up for the low hit points, warding off more attacks, and keeping the Remorhaz in the fight a little longer. In regards to the OCR, this is 1 step over the printed CR. The average attack damage is under the CR value, but because it has an extremely high attack bonus, this makes up for the slightly lower damage it gives off for allowing more hits to land. And just for fun, I took some extra notes as to rounds 4 and 5 if the Remorhaz was doing so much more damage and swallowing. And by the time I got to round 5, if the Remorhaz had swallowed another player, the average damage would ramp up to roughly 85 damage and could be considered a CR 13 at this point. So the more creatures that are swallowed while still having creatures outside to attack, the more damage this Remorhaz is going to do and could be a little higher, maybe stepping into the CR 12 range, possibly hitting CR 13 if the conditions are just right. Anyways, just some interesting things to take into consideration for this monster. Thank you for joining me as we deconstructed the Remorhaz from D&D 5th edition. Join us again next week as we deconstruct another monster from D&D 5th edition. If you've been enjoying these videos, I would really appreciate it if you would share these videos with your friends, your D&D groups. Shoot, if you play Pathfinder or Call of Cthulhu or any other TTRPG, consider sharing it with them. I would really appreciate it, and it could help the channel grow. Until next time when we deconstruct another monster from D&D 5th edition, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.